All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the third and final podcast of the Jewish Education Old Time Radio Hour for at least this year. I should say good morning to our myriad of West Coast listeners, and good afternoon to our East Coast listeners. Mark, a pleasure to be with you again, sharing some quality time.
Great to be back with you, John, and to have an opportunity to reflect on the year and ask some big questions together with our special guest.
Yes. Before we do that, I wanted to at least, because I'm beginning to see it become a huge trend on social media. I just want to make it clear. I have issued a challenge to my board chair, who is from Cleveland, Ohio, as I am from the San Francisco Bay Area, that with the Golden State Warriors about to destroy the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA Finals, that we are officially launching the hashtag NBA Jewish Day School Challenge. And to any Bay Area Jewish Day Schools and to any Cleveland area Jewish Day Schools, I invite you to get in on the action. I'm ordering up a whole host of Steph Curry jerseys to ship out to Cleveland for all of you to wear in celebration of when the Warriors complete this dream season and finish. So anyone wants to get on that, I invite you to join hashtag NBA JDS Challenge, and we will make it happen.
Good luck, John.
You're speechless on that.
Good luck. I'm speechless.
Listen, I can't help that you live in Boston. So, as always, we want to thank ELI Talks, our partner and sponsor, for giving us the opportunity to spend some time talking about issues of importance in the world of Jewish education. We will invite those who are watching and listening live. We would love you to be part of the conversation. If you are on the Google Hangout, there is a question and answer feature. It is in the left-hand scroll bar. It says Q&A, and we promise you if you put in any Qs, we will do our best to provide an A at some point during the conversation. If you are not on the Google Hangout, I don't think you could be watching this. I don't think there's any other way that you could be sharing questions with us. We want to begin with some of our thoughts on sort of news from the field. This is our last one, so we might also use this as an opportunity to sort of reflect back on what we think some of the critical news or hot button issues might be right now in the field, and I will let Mark lead us off there.
Great. I'm going to actually share just some a highlight from our school this year, which is both for me an educational highlight and also raises some interesting questions in terms of news from the field this particular year. We actually, at GAN, we do a series, we call it Limud Klali. We do a speaker series, kind of ethics lab, community conversation series every year. And coincidentally this year, as a result of a lot of feedback from alumni and students, our team of educators decided that we wanted to take on the topic of race, diversity, and privilege. And that was before Ferguson and before all of what was playing out kind of in our American society. And so, a couple of the highlights were we had professors come in and talk about, institutional racism in American society. We had an interesting discussion about the Confederate flag because of the 150-year anniversary, the Civil War. We took on this topic, and interestingly, I observed our students this year organizing around kind of student-generated conversations, in particular in the aftermath of the Ferguson situation, and got to watch high school students figure out what's the nature of the conversation they should be having around race. We ended the year with an alumni panel. We invited several alumni back who had lived in a couple of different countries, done the Peace Corps, City Corps, City Year, and we asked them to reflect to us about the ways GAN prepared them or didn't prepare them to live in a racially diverse society and to deal with kind of the kinds of socioeconomic inequity that they were going to encounter and that these alumni are working to address. And what I think came up for us that I think actually our field should be thinking about, one is, what is the role of a Jewish day school in preparing kind of American citizens, and where on our kind of list of educational priorities is not just current events, but dealing with serious, hard issues that are playing out real time in American society, race, diversity, privilege, which became a huge conversation this year, and I think many of our students don't even know what the word means. What are the outcome goals we want for our kids around these topics? Is this a political question? Is this a moral education question? Especially in a pluralistic school, how do we have conversations about this that don't become just left versus right? And how in schools, most of our schools have some diversity, but not a great deal of racial and ethnic diversity, and we probably have more socioeconomic diversity than we necessarily always acknowledge, but only a given range of socioeconomic diversity, given that most of us are independent schools serving the Jewish community. How do we prepare our kids and educate our kids to be aware of their own place in this society, to be humble and reflective about that, and to kind of go out into the world prepared to engage with the kinds of diversity that I think we promised to prepare kids to engage with. So actually I was really proud of our community this year. I think we took on a topic and we made strides, but for me I think it raised as many questions as it provided answers, and especially in a Jewish day school field that seems to wrestle a lot with how to do tefillah well, and why kids aren't more interested in Hebrew language. I think we just saw playing out on the news every night this year. Very large, big questions about what it means to educate kids in the context of our American democracy and what it means for our particular schools.
Do you have next steps for next year? Like, have you thought about ways that work's gonna continue?
Yeah, I think the next steps for us are continuing to build on many of the conversations that we started this year. I think in particular trying to empower our students more who've now experienced this for a year to help shape the conversations that we're going to be having as a community next year. I think, one of the things that we know but are always, I think, surprised and inspired by is that when we get out of the way and let them shape the conversation, usually it's more educationally powerful. Those are a couple of the things on our agenda.
Well, it's definitely a place where some thought leadership would be useful, and we certainly will look to see what you do next. And I would encourage, as I'm sure would you, anyone for whom this is an area of significance and passion should certainly feel comfortable getting in touch with you and seeing where that conversation can go. I would say from my end, I think that the most obvious, most important thing that's happening in my world, finishing my first year as the executive director of the Schechter Day School Network, is the larger conversation that we announced at the North American Jewish Day School Conference between not the only 5 organizations, but in some ways sort of the 5 intermediaries of the day school space: RovSoc, PEAJ, Schechter, the Yeshiva University Partnership, and PEAJ. I think I said that in the right order. That we've begun a really significant conversation. It's just in the beginning stages. We'll have a lot more to share out with the field, hopefully in the weeks and months to come. That is obviously really critical work. In terms of things that happened this year, I will say in a lot of places I've been really pleased to see the field come together around issues that deal with smaller schools and smaller Jewish communities. And I've seen it bubble up in a few different ways. I will say my colleague at Schechter, Alyssa Capel, took on a lot of this leadership, at least within Schechter. I will also say my counterpart at RovSoc, Dr. Mark Kramer, played a huge role in bringing some of this stuff together. And Alyssa and Mark did some great work around the conference itself, organizing a track that explicitly provided content and expertise for small schools. We've also worked together with our friends at PEAJ to ensure that some of the great programs that they put out around areas of financial sustainability take into account the unique needs of small schools. I think of the 3 of us, soon to be 3 of us engaged in this conversation, I think I've been the one who has run the smallest schools. The 2 schools that I ran would fall into those categories of small Jewish day schools and small Jewish communities. And the challenges are different. Right? When you are the head of school and the de facto development professional and the de facto admissions professional and a whole host of other things, sometimes, even though there are great programs and resources, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're equipped to use them in the ways in which they're being rolled out to larger schools. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think the research that came back from the census this year indicated that I think it was over 50% of Jewish day schools. I might be undersaying it, but it was at least 50% of Jewish day schools have less than 100 students in them. And if that's the reality, then there's definitely good reason to be concerned about the unique needs of small schools. And so I've been pleased to see that I think we've taken some constructive steps this year to begin to think about that. And I think that in the year to come, we're going to see more work in that area. So for me, that's the big what's happening now.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, as someone who's, we're in a larger school environment, obviously, at Kiryat Gan. But, as someone who's engaging with the field as a whole, and as someone in your position now who has, I think, a responsibility both to small schools and to large schools and to the field, I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how the major national networks and foundations and others balance kind of attention to small schools with somehow, kind of being relevant to the entire field at once, and where those tensions play out?
I think it's really challenging. I think one of the biggest the steepest part of the learning curve this year for both me and for Alyssa, who was the head of also a very small community Jewish day school in El Paso, a Rav Sock school that she ran for, I think, 10 or 11 years. So we both came into Schechter in positions of leadership, and our practical experience in the field was in a very particular kind of Jewish day school. So as I've had a chance this year, I think by next week I will have hit my 30th site visit.
Amazing.
And the number of schools most of the schools that I'm visiting are larger schools than I've ever worked in or experienced myself. And so my learning curve has been the reverse. I feel like we have a very good handle on the needs of smaller schools. I don't think that I have yet fully understood how some of these things play out in much larger schools that have much larger infrastructure. And where I think it's interesting is particularly in the areas of change. I think that in some ways change can happen easier and quicker in small schools. But when a large school gets motivated around an issue of change, it really has the power to be transformative. Not just for that school, but with a ripple effect beyond that school that I'm not sure you see in a small schools. I think all of our organizations, listen, I think that we tend, as we do in the Jewish world at large, we tend to focus on certain geographies and certain population centers, which makes a certain amount of sense. That's where a lot of people are and a lot of institutions are. So I think that part of it is finding the right balance, that we want to do things that make sense for our schools that are already successful so they can be even more successful, even more sustainable. But we also want to pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of schools in a lot of places that are operating under a totally different set of circumstances, and they are equally deserving of our attention.
Yeah, I mean, it just raises big questions about the notion of what it means to be a field. Right. When you have, such different cultural contexts and sets of resources and markets, and it just, I think it's an interesting question going forward when we think about these conversations and the field as a whole. Like, what are our common conversations? What are the kinds of things that we really are all genuinely wrestling with, and where are we almost just entirely different businesses?
Right. Well, speaking of conversations, I think this is a great opportunity for us to segue into our guest for today. Mark, I will let you make the introduction.
Great. So we are so excited to have with us today Jonathan Cannon. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks.
Jonathan has been a mentor and a friend of mine, I think many of ours, for a long time. Just by way of formal introduction, Jonathan was most recently the head of school for 12 years at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was the head of school for 6 years at the Carmel School in Hong Kong. Now, Jonathan is working as an educational consultant, in particular working with schools on educational change. He's been a mentor at the Day School Leadership Training Institute, of which John and I are both kind of graduates, and also a mentor in Harvard's Principal Center. And Jonathan, I would say, in a field that is really in need of thought leadership, I consider you a teacher of teachers and a leader of leaders, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on today. I'll just say a little bit about the topic that we're hoping to explore with you today, and then kind of turn it over to you to share some thoughts. I still distinctly remember in 2010 you giving a presentation at the National Jewish Day School Conference, North American Jewish Day School Conference. I'm not sure whether it was RavSoc at that point or everyone together, kind of really pushing us to think out of the box even then about 21st century learning, about what schools of the future would look like, bringing names like Tony Wagner and Daniel Pink kind of right out to the forefront before necessarily they were hip and cool and everyone was reading them. And I think you were pushing us to think, to be ahead of the curve back then. And most recently at the last North American Jewish Day School Conference, you led a session that I think the title was something like, "Let's assume that all our assumptions about Jewish day schools are incorrect." And I think you challenged people to say, you know, look, we oftentimes function as if, yeah, we have some big challenges, but most of what we're doing is pretty good and we're doing okay. And what if we're just off on that? What if actually things aren't working as well as we think they are? And I think John and I would love to hear a little bit about kind of why this session kind of came to be and why this is a particularly burning issue for you, and maybe a little bit about what came up in the session that you led that might generate some big questions that we can wrestle with today. Welcome.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on the show. Thank you for your kind words, but the words from you and from John are really coming from people who I feel myself being immensely learning from, and happy to be part of that partnership. John, you talked a little bit about the NBA, and it's maybe good for me to think about that as I watch my sport imploding at the moment with FIFA being somewhat undermined, which I happen to think is a good thing, but that's probably a conversation for another day. Just something that struck me though when we're, you know, one of the schools that I was talking with this morning is very focused on looking for topics for Hebrew conversation that are relevant and that are motivating and that can draw students outside of the school. And one of the examples that they gave is they're doing a lot of work right now on, it's actually a serious question, whether Israel is going to be allowed to stay as part of the Federal International Football Association. It's a big debate that's happening inside FIFA, and it will be impacted one way or another by the fact that FIFA appears to be going through some, needs to go through some major changes, and their kids are completely, totally engaged in that. They're interviewing it, they're following it in the press, and it just struck me, you know, sometimes you see things that really stick out for you, and that was one. Its whole Hebrew program is based on finding things that energize the students so that they want to be talking Hebrew because they want to find out more about the issue that they're discussing. So that's just a side show that came out through the MBA. And the thing that's been on my mind a lot, it was back when I had the privilege of giving the presentation, I think it was at a RavSoc conference, and again this year, is one of the biggest challenges that the Jewish educational day school world has, and probably myself included, is facing up to the fact that the Jewish day school has some real challenges, and in order to address them, we can't just do, in my view, like marginal changes. That changes need to be, or at least we need to be thinking paradigmatically about what are the changes that are needed, and that was the thrust of the talk way back then, that schools are going to be very different, kids are going to learn differently, and are we going to watch the world go by? Are we going to be at the participating with it? And one of the things that I was challenged to think of by one of my own board presidents is, if Jewish day schools are going to be effective, we can't just be at the sort of we can't just even be participants in change. We have to be at the cutting edge. People have to be able to say, I'm going to this Jewish day school because this Jewish day school is at the forefront of thinking about, asking the questions about what it means to be a Jewish day school right now for the students that are in that Jewish day school right now. You know, to speak to your point, Mark, about the incredible work you've been doing on race relations and on privilege. You know, it's that's the conversation that's out there, and if a school's not part of the conversation, certainly a high school, what is it? at that point if these news items just pass them by. So the question we asked at the conference, and was a group of us, was, well, there's one assumption that seems to be fairly standard. People are asking huge questions about the cost of Jewish day schooling, and there's no obvious solution, but there's hopefully, and I've seen it, serious thought going into resolving that. There's a lot of questions about admission, but there's serious thought going into resolving that as well. There's an assumption that's made is the one thing we don't have to worry about is the quality of the Jewish day school education that we're giving our students. There's this assumption that there's what do they call it, the value proposition, that if we can only have people understand that what we're offering our kids on a day-to-day basis in day schools is so outstanding, then people will somehow find the money and stay within the schools if we can come up with the right models for them to do that. My question is, are we giving our kids, our schools really offering, our Jewish day schools, anywhere close to the quality of education that we could be offering? And are we even asking ourselves the question about that? And if we did, what might be the answers? And, you know, a couple of examples of that is, you know, John, I don't know if you have the same experience, but I know when I travel around the country and I say to schools, what are your top 5 issues facing you right now? By and large, 4 of them will be problems in making the Judaic studies relevant, finding the right people to teach or how to learn Hebrew, tefillah, and Israel engagement. Well, if they're problems and we haven't solved them and 99% of schools list them as 4 of their top 5, it begs the question out there that are Jewish day schools doing anything approaching a decent job in the primary area of their mission? And if we are we sharing that information with each other? Are we keeping it to ourselves? How are we moving that forward? And we threw out, you know, we can certainly build up some of the ideas, some of the thought, but the challenge to people was, don't defend, even if what I'm saying is wrong, or what was being presented is wrong. Don't just leap and say, no, you're wrong. Force yourself to ask the question, maybe it's right, and what dramatic things can we be doing differently? And we looked at enrollment, we looked at costs, we looked at Jewish day school education, we looked at the fact that there's so many students for whom their physical or learning disabilities are preventing them have access to Jewish day school education, and that's a possible crisis. And we looked at back to the old Ravsuck talk, and I'll finish here where we started, that you can go into a number of inner city public schools and see learning, utilization of technology, skills-based learning, which is ahead of some of the Jewish day school learning that we're doing. I pushed the envelope to extremes, but that was to help have a conversation.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. I want to remind people that if they have questions or even comments they want to include in the conversation, if you are on the Google Hangout, you have a Q&A button on the left-hand panel. We would love to include your questions and or your comments into the mix. I think Jonathan just gave us a lot to chew on, some provocative questions and some subjects to think about. So I certainly want to invite people to participate in the conversation should they wish to.
Let me start by throwing out actually what I would call more of a process and a change, leadership, human nature question, and before we get into the substance of some of the areas that you raised, Jonathan, which is, what's your take on the resistance? I mean, why people seem so unwilling to look honestly and acknowledge what I think you're saying are serious, at least potential serious gaps in some of our core areas, like the Jewish education we're providing our kids. Like, what do you see that resistance as being all about?
And before you even answer that, I had also had a sort of initial question, just reflecting back on what you said, which is, where do you think the idea that we are already putting out a product of surpassing excellence comes from?
Mm-hmm. And by the way, who thinks that?
You know, I can share a conversation with you. I can't tell you I bring any expertise beyond what we see in the field. I mean, I think to your question, Mark, one of the most understandable challenges that we face, and I certainly don't put myself outside of that, is that everybody is risk averse. Educators are particularly risk averse, and schools have been by far and away the last to change or the last to look at change. There's a educator, Alan November, who does a lot of work with school change, and one of the points he always makes is, can you imagine going into your doctor and being told that you have appendicitis and you're going to need to have your appendix removed, and you saying to your doctor, oh well, my grandparents had that their appendix removed very successfully, would you mind using the same protocol that you used with my grandparents when you do my surgery? And nobody thinks like that when it comes to surgery, but in school it's not remotely unusual for somebody to say, well, let's look back and see how I learned at school 50 years ago, and that's a good model for us to use because it was successful for me. So I think we have this schools are inherently slow to change. I think we're risk averse, and this is a challenge I know I have, and I know I saw when I was talking with groups. We're leaping into any change or any paradigmatic thinking we do. We're leaping into a space where we don't necessarily know where we're going to come out of it, and yet we can't go into it without taking some kind of leap out of our comfort zone. And we want to know what the outcome's going to be of any risk we take. But once you know that, it's not a risk anymore. It's a process, as you said. So I think there's that. I think the Jewish community, and I don't know the reasons for this, but it's very status quo oriented. A whole group of people can sit around and often say, the status quo is not working at all, but the only thing it's better than is a change to the status quo. And it's, I don't know the reasons for that, but I see it again and again and again. And it's interesting. One of the, I think it was to John's earlier thing, connecting two things together, which was his visits to smaller schools and also the sort of denominational groups beginning to have a conversation about how to work better together. These are not just questions. One of the models that somebody suggested at this session that we had at the day school conference is, why are we so caught up in the paradigm of having different day schools for different denominations? And that's not the same as necessarily having one community day school. There's a model of one school where they have a Orthodox day school and a community day school sharing they're like tracks within the same school. Why does a school have to be 100 students in a place where there's 500 students in 4 different establishments having Jewish day school education? Why can't there be one campus, one school structure, and lots of schools within it, maybe even a school for students who have specific learning needs and facilities to have all kinds of students learning there? And people would then react and say, well, you can't do that. And the answer is, why can't you do that? Well, we just don't do that. What would happen if an Orthodox student saw another student not wearing a kippah or what have you? And so what you end up with is a discussion around the status quo again, which makes it so difficult to leap outside and say, could a dramatically different model be successful?
One of my favorite, a couple of quotes from one of my gurus, Heidi Hayes Jacobs, where she talks a lot about the need not for reform but for new forms. And when you're talking about the status quo, that's what I think about. It's that there's an opportunity here, not just in the educational program, but in the actual form and structure of the way in which education is delivered, all of which could be on the table for thinking of new forms, however outside the box they may be. In fact, perhaps the box is the issue. That perhaps we should be thinking about what would it look like if we were starting without a box and then building something that actually would meet the needs of all of these different constituencies in ways that we haven't yet been able to think about for whatever reason institutionally that's preventing us from getting there.
So something I'm thinking about that I've been thinking about since your presentation in 2010, actually, which is just what does it look like to apply everything you just said, John, and Jonathan as well, to Jewish identity and the Jewish community and Jewish education. And I actually wonder whether, as much as we're not doing anything about it, we have an easier time having the conversation around 21st century learning, around new forms of education. I'm wondering about the deeply held learned beliefs and assumptions that we have about Judaism, Jewish identity, what it means to be an engaged, serious Jew, and therefore the role of Jewish day schools, which to me actually hits even more deeply to literally the question of what a Jewish day school is. You know, is it a Jewish continuity machine that also needs to be a really good school? Is it a great school that has at the center of its mission a sense of kind of particular Jewish purpose and meaning? I don't know. I think these are very big questions, and sometimes I do feel like in terms of, what does she say, reform or
New
not
form.
reform, but new form?
Yes.
You know, I mean, you know, I have to say I'm stunned when I think about the shifts going on in the Jewish world today. Demographically, Israel, the challenges Jews are facing, the amount of time it feels like we spend as day schools thinking about tefillah is mind blowing to me. And it just to me it makes me wonder, you know, kind of, are we clear what we're really doing here? And because the other thing I would say, Jonathan, is like I look around the Jewish world and there are pockets of serious innovation and forward thinking. Most of those people are not Jewish day school people. Mm-hmm. I see it in the Jewish social entrepreneurship world. You see it in some other places. So it's an interesting thing to question, is there also a correlation within the Jewish world? Places where people tend to be more status quo and resistant to change versus places that may tend to be more conducive to being outside the box. And why is it that, I don't know, why is it that maybe there's a higher concentration of them around Jewish education? Maybe easy to explain because we're concerned with the substance and depth and knowledge and kind of transmission of an identity of substance. But that to me is another built-in challenge that we face if we're really trying to get people to think out of the box.
And we should say, and I think that it's true of all of us, we are, you know, and I want to be careful to state, we are seeing enormously creative, innovative, and very exciting work being done in all kinds of Jewish educational environments. So, you know, I think some of the points I'm making, maybe we're all making, are generalized to the field and the system, but not complete, and it's not that people haven't sort of checking that. Also raises a wider question: is how seriously are we watching the people who are experimenting and pushing forward? I don't know. I think there's a point that you made, Mark, which really helps me understand something that you asked me before, which is there's something about 21st century education. What makes it easier to bring into schools is there's nothing really threatening about it. What we're saying is the world has changed, education has changed, so we need to change. It's not really a criticism of what was there before, it's an acknowledgement of a changed world. That's much more difficult when we're talking about Jewish identity and we're talking about content of Jewish day schools, what we should be teaching. You know, there's a number of Jewish day schools really questioning. You talk about tefillah, not just should we be spending time on it. You know, what should we be even having it? You know, I'm not saying I'm in favor of that at all, but it's such an issue. Or when it comes to Hebrew language, does it really matter whether people can do anything other than speak it and understand it when they leave school? Does it really, you know, do they need to write Hebrew? These big questions have been being asked. I'm not quite sure. I think I might be causing some feedback here, but I'm not sure why. But anyway, you know, to that extent, are we asking those deep questions? And I think maybe one of the reasons it's so difficult for all of us as educators to take the leap that entrepreneurs are taking is we are so tied into our mission. And in order to take a leap, you have to take a risk. That are we comfortable saying that even though we know there's lots not working about our mission, we may be risking something even bigger, and we feel like and it's rather grand and it's a bit outrageous. We feel like we kind of own the future of the Jewish people, Jewish day schools, you know. And a lot of research has made that link. Well, when you have that kind of responsibility, are you just going to kind of take, well, yeah, this isn't working, so we'll try this and hopefully it'll work better? Or is that too big of a leap? And just something else you said, and then I'll leave you with this, is, are we doing enough to bring those entrepreneurs into the lay leadership of our Jewish day schools? Are we saying there's people out there in the, I don't mean just there's Joshua Project, there's people out there doing remarkable things, and they're energetic, they're young, they're and are we saying, let's look at who they are and let's bring them into the Jewish day school educational conversation? We may be, but if not, should we and can we?
It's one of the things that you said that really struck me, that I can certainly share, very transparently from a lot of the work that I've been doing this year in the Schechter network, is that I do think that we have schools and leaders who are thinking deeply about some of these issues around Jewish identity. I see it in Schechter in particular. We have Schechter schools who are really thinking about what that really even means and stands for, what it means to be denominationally aligned, if that's what it means to be a Schechter school, what it means to be a school of and for a community and yet still potentially have some denominational affiliation or alignment. Lines are getting blurry. Things are getting confusing. And I do think that we're seeing, at least on the local level, we are seeing schools, I think, grapple very seriously with those ideas, and in some cases coming up with unique solutions. I'll use Community Day School in Pittsburgh has done a lot of work in this area of really thinking deeply about what it means to be to try to be the best of all of those kinds of things while still serving the needs of a particular community. And I've been part of those conversations, and they've been really challenging. I think of all the things I may have written this year that anyone may have actually read, early in the year I wrote a deliberately provocative blog post about whether or not that all Jewish day schools are essentially community day schools, and that came out of hearing from so many of our schools about the tension that they're living with, particularly in communities where the Schechter school may historically have been the only Jewish day school for that community, or the only non-Orthodox Jewish day school for that community, and trying to figure out what that means. How can we be a Schechter school that's organized around a certain way of believing and living, while still trying to be a community, be of and for a diverse community? Are those things in conflict with each other? Can they work together? And each of these schools are struggling through that and thinking about that. And then I think I see in a lot of community day schools also, how do you negotiate what Jewish living and learning looks like when it has to be communally negotiated, palatable to all sides of the community? So I think on the level of the individual school, I think there are really significant conversations that are happening. What I think I'm hoping is beginning to happen now is that those of us who are perhaps a level higher on a more macro level are also going to have very similar and significant conversations, which could lead to totally new ways of thinking about the field that we have yet been able or willing to do.
One thought I have about that in terms of the capacity of people like you, John, and Jonathan, actually, those who are no longer running particular schools, at least in the interim period before you return to the holy work of headship, which I know both of you can't wait to do, is I think that, we've talked about thought leadership. Jonathan, you said something about, we're afraid of our mission. We're very attached to our mission. We have a sense of responsibility to our mission, and one of the reasons we don't take risks is because we feel a sense of sacred responsibility to our mission. I would challenge that and modify it slightly, which is that I actually think we have not fleshed out the where it's about mission and where it's about the translation of that mission into specific kind of practices and principles and strategies for a particular time in a different place, right? It's meta halachic value
Mark, I think you've gone off the grid.
Yeah.
Your mouth is moving, and I'm sure what you're saying is totally critical and important and potentially transformative for the field. And yet, we cannot hear you. And so we will see if we can regain Mark's volume and his insight. Being cognizant of the time, I was curious, Jonathan, if you had any sense for where you see this part of the conversation and your part in this conversation sort of moving forward. So, we've identified some. There's others, but we identified some clear issues. Where do you see these conversations heading? Where would you like to see these conversations heading for people who are really interested in helping shape a different kind of future?
It's the important question, and it's not just me. It's all of us with it. But putting it on, I think the last thing Mark said before we couldn't hear any more things that Mark said, we probably missed the key, and he's now going to say the precise opposite of whatever it is that I think he might have said if he'd have gone if we'd have caught it up from here. But that is that I think Mark is very right that we haven't distinguished, or we often don't distinguish, the mission and what are the strategies and what's the mission itself. One of the things I want to be a part of, and I was hoping, and I think we have had ongoing interest, and we will be sort of meeting again and grouping again, is people who are interested in stepping into that very difficult space, interested in saying that there are strategies, that there may be a difference between mission and strategies. And I would say in a lot of schools, in a lot of my head, a lot of people said they're muddled. It's very difficult to say which is which at times. But we want to step into a space because we know we need to step into a space, not because you or me or Mark or anybody else is saying, if you want to survive, this is what you're going to have to do. It's people are recognizing and people are owning the fact that we need to step into a space where we can be non-defensive about what we've been doing, proud of everything that we've accomplished, not defensive about what we've been doing, and say, can we make a real, can we do something? There must be something significantly different that we can do, because what we're doing is not effective in all kinds of different ways that we're doing. And what I found is there are people, the knowledge and the ideas are out there. I think we were blown away by what we saw come into people's minds, whether it was, and really, there was a group of people at the conference, the sort of discussion part of the conversation, and they were talking amongst themselves about whether we should look at this Hebrew curriculum and that Hebrew curriculum. And one of the groups said, no, the real question is, should we be teaching Hebrew in Jewish day schools at all? Given the limited amount of time that students, I'm not, by the way, validating this or not validating this, I'm trying to indicate what the kind of debate that was taking place is, if we weren't to one person said, if we weren't to teach Hebrew, that would free up X amount of time within Jewish day schools, and this is how we could strengthen some of the Judaic work, or particularly in this person's mind, we don't do enough experiential Jewish education. Let's talk in Hebrew, let's have, and their view is, let's have PE in Hebrew, let's have geography in Hebrew, but let's use the Hebrew time to do something experiential. So again, those are the conversations we want people to have. And then I guess where my personal work and interest comes in is, I believe a lot of schools are having the thinking and the thought, but how to actually implement them. We've talked about so many resistances inside school, whether it's the lay leadership, the professional leadership, the parents, and how do you make that happen inside a school? And to leave you with one paradigmatic change that, I've said it privately, I've said it publicly. If I have to look back, there'll be all kinds of people, as they like to do, debate what contribution I made to Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School when I was there, what I could have done, what I should have done, what I did do. I know I accomplished some good things, and I know that there's things I could do better. One thing I really would love to go back and do again is to involve the students much more in the decision making of the school. I believe that we, and I say I in this case, but I've seen it in a lot of schools, just don't give the students enough trust and honor to realize that they are the ones, that the way education works today is if students don't own it, then it really doesn't happen. And even from a young age, we could be looking at ways of having students lead significant discussions, make significant changes. So we're sitting around, three of us, asking what's the mission and what's the strategy. We're probably asking the wrong people. If we haven't at least got the students front, so to me, if hopefully this will carry on, I say interview a student for your next program. Bring in a panel of students.
Agree.
Them. Let's talk about mission. Let's talk about future of Jewish day school education. Let's talk about what works.
It's a great idea, and let's just take a moment to acknowledge how much more significant we were able to carry the conversation forward without Mark being part of it. Let's just take that moment, just the space that we've been given to really just sort of think clearly and be able to listen without Mark's engagement. I think definitely furthered the conversation.
It's a paradigm shift, and that's what we
need. Yeah. Definitely a paradigm shift. I will tell you that when I visit schools, I leave it somewhat open-ended as to sort of who I see and who I see when I'm part of those. And on 3 occasions this year, the school on its own decided that they wanted me to meet with students to be able for me to share with them what I do, and for them to share with me whatever they wanted to share with me. And those are probably among the best conversations that I had in schools that I visited. So I think that's a really wonderful idea. So we are heading towards the end of our final podcast of our first year of doing this together. This would have been the part of the conversation where Mark and I were going to reflect on what we've gotten out of this experience, and to talk a little bit more about what we think for the future. We'll see if Mark's able to rejoin us. I will take the opportunity right now, first of all, to thank you, Jonathan, for joining us this afternoon. It's been really great to have a chance to talk with you and to think with you, to hear from you. Mark, you're back.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
I'm glad you had the space to have a more productive conversation with me just listening.
That was a wonderful example of Thyme in action. I mean, I really have to credit you for really. I mean, you walk the walk. You don't just talk the talk. I mean, you walk the walk, and that's something to be admired.
Thank you, John.
I was thanking Jonathan for his contributions and his leadership and his thought and thinking with us today. And then, Mark, I was going to then leave us for these last couple of minutes just to give us each an opportunity, if we wanted to talk a little bit about our experience this year and maybe our hopes and dreams for the future. I'll say for myself, first of all, I'm really grateful to ELI Talks for giving us the opportunity to have this forum, to play with it, to experiment. I had said from the beginning, just if all that happened out of this was that I would have an opportunity to spend a couple of afternoons talking Jewish education with my good friend Mark, that in and of itself would have been enough for me to want to do it, and that's definitely been the case. So I've had just that in and of itself has been of wonderful value for me. I would really love to be able to continue this. I think we have a lot of opportunity there's a lot of exciting things happening in the field. I think we could do a better job engaging more people and joining us in the conversation. That would be one of my goals for the future. But if ELI Talks will have us, I would be thrilled to be able to see what we can do with this into next year.
Yeah. I would just say a couple things. One is I'm grateful. I'll echo the gratitude to ELI Talks and to just the vision behind the entire ELI Talk kind of initiative, both for launching the whole idea, because I think we just need more conversation about big ideas in the field, and I think giving more people voices and the encouragement to talk about things they think are of consequence. So I'm really grateful for them also in giving us the chance to try this out. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to think with you, John, both on air and off air, and to kind of connect with each other and to share our different perspectives. The two things I'm thinking about, in addition to what you said, which is just how to get more people into the conversation, which I think maybe we could do with some pre-work and some soliciting kind of questions in advance. And one is just the exercise in thinking about what we should be thinking about. was valuable for me. You know, kind of the behind-the-scenes Google Doc running list of the kinds of topics that we, from where we sit, think the field should be talking about, I think was a really important exercise. It got me up on the balcony, a place that it was fun to be up there with you. And the second actually was to think about what kind of conversation would be both substantive and fun. I think we could do more of the fun. And I think it's important, if we're going to push people and ourselves to be part of these conversations, that they not only be stimulating intellectually, but that we have fun and we're able to be playful in the process, because I think that's what's going to help us to stay in it, especially when we're wrestling with the big, hard questions.
No question. I am certainly all about fun. For sure, for sure. Well, listen, I will, of course, hopefully speak with you again, but
Yep.
while we're in this way, Mark, I wish you a successful close to what I'm sure has been another successful school year for you, and hope that your summertime gives you at least a little bit of opportunity to rest and relax and recharge. And and we will announce if and when we are returning and how we're returning. We will certainly let you know, and our hope is that we will be able to continue the conversation in the year to come. And with that, I think we will say goodbye. Hopefully